Hello, besties, and welcome back to another episode of the Your Two Best Friends podcast. Today, we have a fun episode that Annalise and I have been excited to do, talking about books that really have shaped our faith or changed the way we think about things that we thought would be fun to recommend to you and explain a little bit about why this book is so important to us. So often, I feel like I'm looking for more resources, more books to read, and more recommendations. And so maybe you all are too. And so we wanted to share some of our favorite that we feel have helped shape us into the people that we are today.
So for me, one of those books that was really influential in my life and really changed the way that I perceived things was the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And this one is not like inherently a Christian book. It is a spiritual book though, a spiritual work, and also psychological, which is interesting. And so this is by an individual who was placed in a Nazi concentration camp, actually specifically a Nazi death camp, and he survived. And he just is sharing in his writing how he was able to survive through that camp and why other individuals were also able to survive, and that was actually through finding meaning in their suffering. That even though they were experiencing so much hardship, those individuals who had a purpose in their life were individuals who then were willing to push themselves so that they could survive. And so for him, it was that he wanted to see his wife again when he left the concentration camp. And then also that he had this work called logotherapy, and he wanted to finish his work. And so those were things that kept him going and pushing through. And he talked about how he could tell when an individual was going to die soon. And often it was when they just started giving up. They would trade their meals for cigarettes instead of wanting that meal so they could live another day, and they just kind of accepted their fate. And it was definitely a hard read, hearing about some of the conditions, that what it was like in those Nazi concentration camps. But it was really remarkable to see this story unfold and to hear more about how we also can find meaning in the things that we are experiencing. And I know for me, before reading this book and a couple other books that I'm going to talk about later, I really had this view of I hated suffering, and I still do hate suffering, but I would avoid it at all costs, whatever I could do. And reading this book showed me that I don't need to run away from suffering or to try and numb out in the face of suffering, but rather that when those experiences happen, that I can find meaning in it or find purpose in it, and that will actually push me to continue to survive. And so some quotes from the book that really stuck out to me were, I'll read them. So one is, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And so something that he talks a lot about is our responsibility, how we can't choose how other people treat us, but we can choose how we are going to react. We can choose how we're going to respond. Another thing that he said is, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And then lastly, he says, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. And so it's been really cool that this book, number one, has really influenced myself, but because it's also embedded with like different psychological practices and even some different techniques, it's something that I've been able to use with some of the clients that I see. And a lot of them have experienced a lot of suffering, and a lot of them have chosen to numb that suffering by using drugs and by using alcohol. And so it has been really interesting to show them that there can be another way, that you can actually, even though people might be treating you horribly, like, you get to decide how you're going to respond. Like, that's what you are responsible for. And you're responsible for looking and seeing, is there something like purpose behind this? Can I find purpose in this? And then an example of this was in the book. Viktor Frankl is talking about an individual who came to him. This was outside of the Nazi concentration camp, and was saying that he was so disheartened because his wife was dead, and now he's living life without her. And his response to him, or somehow they came to this conclusion that, well, if it was the other way around, then his wife would be the one who was going on living without him. And so by her passing sooner, meaning behind that is he saved his wife from suffering. And that was a way that he was able to contend with that hardship he was experiencing. And so I just really appreciated that book, and it really helped me to see things differently when I'm experiencing difficulties.
That's really good. Another book that Annalise and I have both read that we both really felt like changed our faith and really gave us a lot of perspective. You've heard us mention this in another podcast, but The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is an excellent writer. He writes, fun fiction in Narnia, and he wrote lots of other theological works. We have one other we'll recommend on this podcast, but we can really, in good faith, recommend all of C.S. Lewis's works if you're looking for things that are, theological or apologetic. But The Screwtape Letters is a series of letters that are written by a senior demon to his young nephew about learning the basics of the art of temptation. So you don't get to see like the nephew's letters back. It's just the uncle writing to his nephew. But what you do see is the nephew trying to tempt a certain young man who they call the patient. So since it's from the demon's perspective, God is called the enemy in it, and humans are called creatures, or the certain person that he's trying to tempt is called the patient. And as the story progresses, the uncle is getting more and more frustrated with the nephew because he can't lead this patient down a path of temptation. He's like continuously turning back to God. And it really offers insight into the way that maybe the devil might try to tempt us in our lives, things that we may not have realized were maybe tactics of the enemy, or things that in human nature we give into, and they're kind of silly when you think about it. But it also talks about how there's a lot of quotes where they don't really care how they get people to help. They just care that they do it. That God must be, self-serving. They can't understand how, because he seems so contradicting, like loving these humans even though they don't serve him or don't love him well or don't love each other well. But it's really, really good because it kind of is a play on it. And so it allows you to see it from another perspective of what the enemy or hell is trying to do to you. And so you kind of can see it from that perspective. And it's also a way that, hell is real, demons are real, whether they're doing exactly what's happening in here and they're responsible for all the things that they write about, we don't know. But it also causes you to think like, oh, this spiritual realm is definitely more active than we give it credit for. And C.S. Lewis himself, he wrote an ending to it, and like a toast. It ends with like a toast at this feast, and they're feasting on the souls of people who went to hell. And he was ending it with writing to the reader, and he was saying, people wanted him to add more and more, but he really didn't like getting into the mind of demons to write the book. The book is really good. It's a satirical piece, and it's really, really creative how it gets you to think of this. I thought it was going to be really silly in the beginning, like two demons writing to each other. I was like, he's out of his mind. This could not possibly be good. And then it's really one of the books that totally changed the course of my faith. So highly recommend. Pretty simple and not very long read. But he was saying, he didn't want to ever enter back into that. So people kept asking him to extend the book. And he was like, no, I don't want to go back. It was so hard to be in that perspective and to think in that like evil way how to lead a person down to hell. But so many people were like, this has helped me so much. So Not a very long read, but we'd highly recommend it. Then some of our favorite quotes. We could go on probably till the end of time with quotes from this book that were really good. I have it on my iPad and I was going through like 30 highlights to try to find these. But two of them that I really like that kind of give you an example of the book is, indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot without sudden turnings, without milestones, and without signposts. That to me was so revolutionary because I was like, oh my gosh, they were talking about how they don't care if someone's super evil. They could be super evil and they're like, that's great because it causes a lot of damage, but we'll take someone who's just apathetic towards the faith, who just is apathetic in life and doesn't really live a crazy evil life, but doesn't turn to the Lord. So it doesn't matter. We'll take the soul either way. The other one that's I really like is, but we want a man hag-ridden by the future, haunted by visions of an imminent heaven or hell upon earth, ready to break the enemy's commands in the present if by doing so we make him think he can attain the one or avert the other, dependent for his faith on the success or of failure of schemes whose end he will not live to see. We want a race perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, never honest, nor kind, nor happy now, but always using as mere fuel wherewith to heap the altar of the future every real gift which is offered to them in the present. So, talking about sacrificing all the virtues that the Lord wants for us in pursuit of the future. You know, like we don't need to rest now. We don't need to be kind or good now. The ends will justify the means. The end of life, when I have ignored my family and, you know, just focused on money, or when I have been not kind to people, but something in the future is justifying that for me. We don't know if we're living tomorrow. So it's talking about we sacrifice all these things that build up our character in the present on the altar of the future that we may never live to see, or is not going to be what we thought it was because we're not who the Lord wants us to be now. So really, really good. Highly recommend it.
Yeah. And I know for me, reading it was definitely very beneficial and helped me to see different things that maybe I was turning a blind eye to in my life. And it definitely helps to point those things out. So I would totally agree that everyone should read it. It's such a good book. And another book that I would highly recommend, and both of us really enjoyed, and it really changed the way that we view work, really, is the book Garden City by John Mark Comer. And as you know, we are John Mark Comer stans, so obviously he made this list. But this book talks about how we are to work and how we are to rest. And both of these things are important because we are made in the image of God, and God is a working God, and he's also a God who rests. And we can see that in the creation story where God is working and then he takes a day of rest. And that is where the book begins, in the garden, and how God calls Adam and Eve to rule over the land, and how this actually took place before the fall. I think sometimes people think that we have to work. We have to get up early and go to work because it's part of the fall. No, that was a part. Work was a part of God's design before sin entered the world. And through that, we get to, the book talks a lot about cultivating the earth, and that is our job. And we get to do that through both jobs that we view as more sacred and others that are viewed as secular, whereas they can all be worship to God. And they can also, all of those are vocations. I think sometimes people refer to working at a church as vocational ministry, but vocation just means your calling. And so we're all called to something. And the Lord can use our work if it is honoring to him and if it's not harming people. Like those are very that's very important if it's going to honor the Lord. And so a quote from the book that kind of encompasses some of this is, for starters, it means that your work is a core part of your humanness. You are made in the image of a working God. God is king over the world, and you're a king, a queen, royalty, ruling on his behalf, gathering up the creation's praise and somehow pushing it back to God himself. And I know that this book was really helpful for me because I think it took off some of this pressure that I felt like I needed to work at a Christian job. And in the book, John Mark Comer says the term Christian is a better noun than an adjective. I am a Christian, right? Because I'm a Christian, that means that my work is following Christ, right? And so instead of saying like, oh, she's a Christian counselor, oh, she's a Christian artist, she's a Christian whatever. No, she's an artist who's also a Christian. She's a counselor who's also a Christian. And so I think it took off some of this pressure that like I needed. The only job that, or like the jobs that were the most fulfilling were those that were within a church, and instead showed that work that is honoring to God is good. And so that looks like a lot of different things. That can also look like being a mother, and it can look like being a teacher at a public school, whatever. So it really helped to shape some ideas that I had about work.
Yeah. I also read this book actually upon Annalise's recommendation when I was going through a season of my life, really trying to figure out like, what does my career look like? Does God have a specific calling on my life? That's a really hot buzzword in Christian circles. Like, what are you called to? And it was really helpful where he talks about like purpose, that you have a purpose that God's created you for. And some people also don't get to work in vocations that they feel really passionate about or they feel purpose in. And kind of like setting you free from even that, where you have to work in a Christian setting in order to be doing ministry on earth, or that is like the holiest vocation you could do is to be a pastor or a missionary or a worship leader. When he starts like in the book where he's like, serving God well and fulfilling your calling could be being a really, really good chair maker. You make the best chairs. And that is honoring God. That's being integrous in your work. It's doing things to the best of your ability. And we need people to do that. We need engineers and we need doctors and we need journalists and we need so many things that help society to run, but we tout some vocations above the other. And that really also helped in the same way set me free from things where you can consider different things and your career may look different throughout your life, but your purpose can remain the same. Maybe God has equipped you to be a discipler and or a mentor, and he gives you different vocations or different opportunities to do it along the way. Maybe he's equipped you to be an evangelist, and sometimes that looks like a pastor, and sometimes that looks like being an engineer but having a lot of influence over your coworkers. So it's a really good book for people who are in that season of life, dissecting work, also figuring out, why does God like work? Why does the God of Christianity also work? When he talks about how other religions, we have the only religion where God works with us, where it's not like a hierarchy and work is viewed as lesser and the people who are at the bottom are the ones that work and you're working up to this status where you don't have to. How even in heaven we're going to work. So it was a really beautiful book and definitely challenged a lot of the perspectives I had on a lot of those topics, and in a really influential time in my life where that was needed. Another great book that I really love that I would recommend is called Walking with the Poor by Bryant L. Myers. And it's about principles and practices of transformational development. Annalise and I have degrees in intercultural studies and spent a lot of time studying community development and transformational development in school, as well as what does bringing God's justice to earth look like in our world. And so this book really focuses on transformational development. And if you're not familiar, it's this idea that during the fall, there were 4 relationships that were broken. The relationship between us and God, us with ourselves, us with our community, and us with the environment. And so when we think of someone being in poverty, we only think about financial poverty, but there are multiple types of poverty that we all succumb to or we all struggle with in our lives that maybe we don't realize because we only view financial poverty as something that's worth addressing or ministering to, when there's relational poverty and emotional poverty and spiritual poverty. And so it really talks about when you want to work with the quote unquote poor, your demographic is much larger than you think. Some of my favorite quotes from the book that I think really give a good picture is, the net result of the fall on the economic, political, and religious systems is that they become the places where people learn to play God in the lives of the poor and the marginalized. When fallen human beings play God in the lives of others, the results are patterns of domination and oppression that mar the image and potential productivity of the poor, while alienating the non-poor from their true identity and vocation as well. When we ignore the idea that we have poverties, that the fall has affected us in different ways, then we do an injustice to ourselves as well as the poor. We view people in financial poverty and are like, well, they deserve all the pity. That's the worst thing in the world. When a lot of people in financial poverty are also in communities where they don't have relational poverty. They don't have as much emotional poverty, but we view one as way worse than the other. And so it changes the way that we view people who are experiencing injustice around the world. Another great quote is, poverty is about relationships that don't work, that isolate, that abandon, or devalue. Transformation must be about restoring relationships, just and right relationships with God, with self, with community, with the other, and with the environment. So that is what justice looks like. It's not just restoring financial poverty, but it's addressing all of the results of the consequences of the fall and all the poverties that has induced in humankind, and how we then react with the world, with ourselves, with other people, because those things were all broken when sin entered the world. So when we're talking about doing work or doing justice, it's a great book that framed my thinking for working with the marginalized and people who are oppressed, and that demographic of people, coming into it in humility, understanding that I have my own poverties, that in the West, maybe we're not seen as having a lot of financial poverty, although we definitely do. We have a lot of other poverties that affect us spiritually and emotionally just as much. So I'd really recommend the book if that is something you're interested in. It's a really great read.
That is so good. And before, when you were talking about the book, I had not thought that I had read it, but I do remember reading this in school now.
Yeah.
And it is very good. And those practices and those ideas of how to best reach the poor, and how important it is community to practice community development is so important, and really shape the way that I think a lot about the way that I help others, the way that even the ministries that I want to participate in, things like that. And so I definitely agree that is such a good recommendation for anyone, but specifically those who are really interested in probably like social justice. That would be a really helpful read.
Mm.
And then another book that I wanted to talk about is the book Suffering is Never for Nothing. And this is by Elizabeth Elliot. And she's pretty popular. Her husband was Jim Elliot, and they were missionaries, and he was killed while he was attempting to minister to this unreached group. And obviously that's really disheartening, but in addition, Elizabeth Elliot has also experienced, she remarried and lost that husband as well, I believe, to cancer. And so she has just experienced a lot of hardship. And so she used some of that hardship and some of the knowledge that she learned from her experience to write this book. And it was really impactful and influential to me, because I know for me, an area that I really struggled in, and I think a lot of people struggle in, is not understanding why we suffer, and not understanding how we suffer well. And I think that is also why Man's Search for Meaning was really impactful to me. And really both of these books like went hand in hand in that season. I read both of them back to back, and they really influenced me. And so some quotes from her book are, if your faith rests in your idea of how God is supposed to answer your prayers, your idea of heaven here on earth or pie in the sky or whatever, then that kind of faith is very shaky and is bound to be demolished when the storms of life hit it. But if your faith rests on the character of Him who is eternal, the eternal I am, then that kind of faith is rugged and will endure. And then she also shared, whatever is in the cup that God is offering me, whether it be pain and sorrow and suffering and grief, along with the many more joys, I'll willingly take it because I trust Him. And so throughout reading this book, it really just showed me that ultimately my faith needs to be in God. No matter what suffering I experience, no matter what hardship I see other people experience and go through, that my faith needs to be firmly planted in the Lord. And yeah, in the little sufferings and in the big sufferings. And I think that one thing that I really enjoyed about her writing was that she explained suffering as either getting what you don't want or not getting what you do want. And so that kind of covers a vast array of things that we'll experience in life. And so that looks like little suffering and really big forms of suffering. And so she talked about how one of her daughters just never complained, that when these little things happened, when her laundry won't run, or when she spills coffee all over her car, she doesn't complain. And those might be forms of like little suffering, but ultimately it's preparing us for when we experience harder times. And so I think that is something that really impacted me. Was I remember talking to Alec, like, call me out anytime I complain. I just didn't want that to be a part of my language. So even when small things would happen in my life, just accepting that, okay, the suffering isn't for nothing. Like, I whatever got in a car, like a little car accident or whatever, but it's not for nothing. And just accepting, I guess, when these difficult things happen in life, and not letting this take away from my faith and my trust in God.
So good. Another book is another C.S. Lewis book. We're big C.S. Lewis fans and big John Mark Comer fans, so we have one more recommendation from each that are coming. But A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis is a little bit different than his other theological works. This one, he has a book called The Problem with Pain, and that is a theology of suffering, and it's kind of like an arm's length view away, viewing the problem of suffering and the problem of pain in the world from a theological perspective. The book A Grief Observed is literally his journals from the couple weeks after losing his wife to cancer. And it's a really short read. It is not very long, but it is a book that really helps if you've gone through any type of grief or suffering in your life. I guess that's kind of a theme of these books. Annalise and I think really resonate with those things, and yeah, helping this shape that theology in our own life. But it really feels like a, you're watching him process this. You're watching him process this with his faith. And I'm reading these journals and I'm like, if that happened to me, I would not be writing this eloquently and this wonderfully as he's experiencing like such difficult pain in his life. I've seen it recommended on lots of even secular places where people are looking for something to help with grief, and people will be like, I'm not a believer, but A Grief Observed really helped me so much. So it really is widely regarded as a really great book to help you process grief in your life if you've experienced a loss. But the book is really him talking about wrestling this suffering and this grief with the character of God. And he says in the beginning, I don't think this will cause me to lose my faith, but who am I going to see God as during it? Like, what am I going to either realize about God during this that I'm scared of? Is he going to be worse than I thought? Or how am I going to reconcile this? And so it's really, really excellent in that sense. It's talking about how he views his faith, how he views his wife, how he views, life after death, what people on earth mean to us. And so it's really beautiful. I cried the whole time. But it's really short, and it really is something that I find so much comfort in, even though it's kind of a sad read. So I think it's just, yeah, other human beings understanding emotional pain. It makes people feel not really alone. And it puts words, I think, to things for those of us who maybe aren't writers or aren't so eloquent, that you're like, oh, this is what I'm feeling. Someone's writing it. Questions I have for God, things I don't understand. So, really, really beautiful book. One of my favorite quotes from it is, if my house has collapsed at one blow, that is because it was a house of cards. The faith which took these things into account was not faith but imagination. The taking them into account was not real sympathy. If I had really cared, as I thought I did, about the sorrows of the world, I should not have been so overwhelmed when my own sorrow came. It has been an imaginary faith playing with innocuous counters labeled illness, pain, death, and loneliness. I thought I trusted the rope until it mattered to me whether or not it would bear me. Now it matters, and I find it didn't. He has another quote that's really good in there where it's talking about, this idea of a rope. So he's calling this back, where he's like, you say you have faith, and it's easy to say we have faith when it doesn't matter if we do. We don't have to bet our life on it, bet all of our hope on it. He's saying, like, you trust a rope until it matters if it will bear you or you will die because the rope isn't strong enough. Like, we trust our faith in God, or we trust God until then our own sorrows come. And did we really trust God? Do we find in that time when we're experiencing hardship and pain that we trust God, or we have faith through that? So I think most every Christian can relate. I think every Christian has experienced grief and hardship, or they will. And so a lot of these books making sense of suffering are really good, and they're personal as well. But there's something about reading his journal about this raw, like, I don't understand what's going on. I'm crying. No one can understand. This book he actually released during his lifetime under a different name because he didn't want to be associated with it. He thought it was kind of embarrassing releasing his journals. And multiple of his friends actually found this work, and they were seeing him really struggling with his wife's death and being in grief, and they recommended his own book back to him. And they're like, oh, we think this would really help you process the pain of losing your wife. And it was his own book. So kind of a funny story. And then it was published under his name after he died.
That is hilarious. But I have not read that book, but hearing you speak about it in the past definitely makes me want to read it. Also, maybe not, because it sounds very sad, but
Yeah.
I think I will.
I think for those of us that are married, it's like you're reading about someone losing their spouse. And even if you have other grief, you're like, I was crying through it because it was like, wow, this really is the most painful thing.
Yeah.
But it does give you hope in that as he's like getting better and processing through grief. But if you are married, and it's kind of a really sad read. So yeah.
Another book that both Danielle and I really enjoyed and really influenced us was The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by, again, John Mark Comer. And this one, I think, was pretty popular. A lot of people read this book. And this is actually how I first found out about him, was because the book was so popular. And in this book, John Mark Comer talks about how we are like running this rat race, that we are constantly moving, that there's social media keeps us constantly entertained, that we are working really long hours, that we are constantly adding more to our plate, more and more, and that we have this, what he calls hurry sickness, and that that is the thing that is keeping us away from intimacy with God ultimately. And he was speaking with one of his mentors in his life, and I think he asked him, like, how do I how do I ensure that like I remain in relationship with Lord, like growing in him? And his mentor said, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry. And so throughout the book, John Mark Comer shares examples of how we have hurry in our life, but then he also gives examples and explains how you can eliminate that hurry from your life, like slowing your speed of life. So maybe that means cutting back from certain things. He also talks about Sabbath, taking a day of rest where you're not working and you're having to rely on the Lord because you're not working. And there's a couple other things that he also talks about in how we can slow down our pace of life. And this book really affected me because that is definitely something I have struggled with, where I do feel like this constant need to be stimulated or this constant need to be working. I'm not doing enough. I need to get more done. And instead accepting that it's good to slow down, it's good to have margin in our life, because often that's when we can actually hear God's voice. When we are constantly moving, it's so hard to hear him because we're so distracted. And instead, creating this space where we are undistracted and when we can just like be settled and have peace. And honestly, this book reminded me of when Danielle and I were in our undergrad. One of the assignments that they had us do was to go to a hermitage. That we had to, we went away for a weekend. We had like a little family dinner, all of us, and then we were all separate. We had these like small little cabins, and we were fasting during that time. I think we had like some bread and cheese or something, and they gave us some water, and we just had this time to ourselves. And I remember them talking about like when you first get in there, because you didn't have your phone, it was you and a Bible. And that when you first get in there, that like your thoughts are going to be racing because you're constantly moving so fast. And I did experience that like thinking about whatever, but then eventually it just was like still and slow, and I was able to wake up in the morning and just have like a really calm, chill morning with the Lord. And his voice was so clear to me as I'm reading the Bible and as I'm journaling. And so this book really brought me back to that season where I had to be really intentional and take that time with the Lord, and how it's important to create those kinds of moments in our everyday life. And even maybe monthly doing something like that. That isn't something I've incorporated, but maybe that is something I need to. But like monthly, taking a day for retreat where it is just you and the Lord, and you're separate from your phone, you're separate from other people, and it gives you time to hear from him. And so some quotes that we have from this book that are just really good and really share some of these principles and things that he talks about is, he says, because what you give your attention to is the person you become. Put another way, the mind is the portal to the soul, and what you fill your mind with will shape the trajectory of your character. In the end, your life is no more than the sum of what you gave your attention to. It's so good. He also says, we hear the refrain, I'm great, just busy. So often, we assume pathological busyness is okay. After all, everybody else is busy too. But what if busyness isn't healthy? What if it is an airborne contagion wreaking havoc on our collective soul? And then lastly, he says, hurry and love are incompatible. And so all these quotes are just so good, and I feel as I'm reading, I'm convicted. But it's a very incredible book, and I think for anyone specifically living in the US, you should read it. And it will, even those that aren't Christians, this will change the way that you you view like work and this grind. I got to keep grinding, and allow for margin in your life.
He also has a 10-episode podcast on this, which will link all these books and that below. But it talks about even more that he couldn't fit into the book. And I remember even on that podcast talking about it, and it might talk about this in the book too. It's been a couple of years since I read it,
Hmm.
but Annalise and I definitely agree it's one of our favorite reads. It's a very, it's simple. He writes really easy to read,
Yeah.
but you're so challenged the whole time, where Jesus spent 33 years on this earth and yet he was not constantly busy. And
Hmm.
so why do we think we have to be? He Sabbathed. He always had time to be interrupted. That was like a big thing that they talked about, where he always made space for those interruptions, for people that needed healing, for people that needed him to talk to them, for teaching, for things like that, that allowed him to be present in people's lives. And talking about how when we see interruptions as inconvenience,
Hmm.
people who need things in our lives, or people who need we don't make that space for real life to happen for other people and for us to be able to minister to them in that. And we're filling it with things that we think are so important that at the end of the day don't matter.
Hmm.
We need far less in our lives than what we think we do. We need to do far less than what we think we need to do. um my husband and I have really like talked about this book in depth, and one of the goals for this year because of this idea is to be boring. Jeff Bethke, he wrote a similar book, and him and John Mark Comer do the podcast together. I saw that that was one of his themes for this year, and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna jump on that, because I used to be like, oh, I'm so busy, I'm so running around, I'm so busy.
Hmm.
And I was like, why do we like that? Why do we like saying that in
Yeah.
life? Like, why is it something where if you don't say, like, oh, we're good, but we're just so, like, things have been so crazy lately? I say that, even still all the time. And then I'm like, oh, wait, no, it hasn't. Like, this week's actually been really, really chill. I'm just so used to saying that because that's how my life, like, I planned my life. And I've
Hmm.
noticed so much in my attitude change in myself. And so we really recommend this book. Or if you're a podcast person, that's another really good podcast to listen to. John Mark Comer, we could recommend his books all day. He has a brand new one called Practicing the Way. We won't talk about that here, but that is a book. Annalise and I talked a little bit about some of his work done in our episode on When You Stop Feeling God. But Practicing the Way is all about, becoming a disciple and like Christ. And it includes those phases of what that journey might look like. So that's one of his newer books. My husband is reading it and he talks about it all the time. I have yet to read it, but I would recommend it. I think already we know John Mark Comer, he's got really good things to say. So the last book that we are going to talk about is called The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And when Annalise and I were thinking about what are some books that really either changed the course of our faith or really, really made us sit down and make some changes to our lives, this one was probably the first one that I thought of. I read this during COVID in its entirety, and it's translated from German. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is not the easiest read. I will say I did have to read this maybe sometimes a few times, certain passages, to process what he's saying and try to understand it. But it really was a book that changed the way I viewed following Jesus. The first chapter is all about something he calls a costly grace. And mind you, he's also writing this from a concentration camp. He lived during the Holocaust as well, and he did not survive in the concentration camp. He actually was a Christian, but he was in the concentration camp for how much he spoke out against what the Germans were doing to the Jewish people. He was seeing that in Germany, so many Christians were complacent and they were fearful maybe of what would happen to them if they started speaking up, that they incorporated like Nazi flags in their churches. They really became very nationalist, the Christian churches. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer actually was able to come to the US. He was getting persecuted in Germany during this time, and he realized in the US that he said, he was living a privilege that his fellow Germans didn't have. And that's where he felt he was called to minister. So he actually went back to Germany and was placed in a concentration camp and was ministering to people the whole time. I mean, he was ministering to guards, he was ministering to his fellow inmates, and he was executed 3 days before the camp was freed on purpose because some of the higher ups in Germany, they knew they were losing, and it was very personal. They knew that he was talking poorly about, the Germans and what they were doing with the Jews, and it was personal. They knew they were losing, and they still were like, no, you have to sentence him to death. So talk about a man who really lived out his Christian faith. But one of his quotes that really impacted me about the way I think about grace, that's one of the first chapters of the book. It says, such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it cost a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. Ye were bought at a price, and what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. Costly grace is the incarnation of God. It really challenged the way I view grace. He talks a lot about the idea of costly grace versus cheap grace, and how if it doesn't change the way we live, then we are cheapening grace. We are living in a cheap grace that costs us nothing, but cost God everything. When we sin and we're like, oh, grace covers it, it doesn't change the way we live our life. That is not living in the costly grace that God has purchased for us. That is not living true discipleship. That is not change, because he talks about this idea that grace is supposed to change the way that we live. We should not look the same after we accept Jesus, because we're forgiven and we're given grace, but that should change our desires to sin. The grace should not, make us sin more or the same and be like, well, it's covered, so it doesn't really matter. We should recognize how much it cost God to give that to us, and that should change the way we live our life. The other favorite quote I have from this book, and I have so many, I really was going back through it and seeing so many underlines. When Annalise and I were planning for this episode, I had like 10 quotes on this, and I was narrowing them down to what I thought were some of the best ones. So it's another book that I think you're going to get a lot out of. But it says, the path of discipleship is narrow, and it is fatally easy to miss one's way and stray from the path, even after years of discipleship. And it's hard to find. On either side of the narrow path, deep chasms yawn. To be called to a life of extraordinary quality, to live up to it and yet be unconscious of it, is indeed a narrow way. To confess and testify to the truth as it is in Jesus, and at the same time to love the enemies of that truth, his enemies and ours, and to love them with the infinite love of Jesus Christ, is indeed a narrow way. To believe the promise of Jesus, that his followers shall possess the earth, and at the same time to face our enemies unarmed and defenseless, preferring to incur injustice rather than to do wrong ourselves, is indeed a narrow way. To see weakness and wrong in others and at the same time refrain from judging them, to deliver the gospel message without casting pearls before swine, is indeed a narrow way. The way is unutterably hard, and at every moment we are in danger of swaying from it. If we regard this way as the one we follow in obedience to an external command, if we are afraid of ourselves all the time, it's indeed an impossible way. But if we behold Jesus Christ going on before, step by step, we shall not go astray. So obviously thinking about the context of what he was writing this in and his life, and understanding just how much suffering he was living through, and then to write this is something that it really did. It changed the way I thought about Jesus, the way I thought about my own life, how I think about grace, how I think about following Jesus. So it's really a beautiful read. Annalise and I'm sure, could recommend books, so many. We are both very avid readers and love to read. So if we had more time, we would probably list 30,000 other books, and maybe we'll do a part 2 of other books that really felt like we felt that they changed our lives. But These are some of just our favorites that we thought we would recommend to you. So we hope that you are able to maybe get a new read and get some new resources that will help you in your journey of following Christ. That's always the goal for us. And so we hope that we were able to encourage you in that today and equip you with more things to read or listen to if you're an audiobook type of person. So thank you for tuning in. We will see you next week on the Your Two Best Friends podcast. Bye, everyone.